How many are on Zoom? Tom, how many?
Tom, how many on Zoom?
One so far. But it's early days.
They're just waking up.
Well, no reason to delay further. What I want to do for just what I call too much information, which seems to be typical, especially in dealing with the Eastern Front, where we're less familiar with the geography and less familiar with the intricacies of the history. It's just to recap very quickly a couple of key points. June 22nd, 1941, the German army with an element of the Romanian army totaling about 3 million attacked the Soviet Union. In the period of 6 months, from June 22nd to about December 5th, approximately 5 million Soviets are lost. That's putting aside civilian losses and things of that nature. An enormous amount of equipment is lost. Over 5,000 airplanes are lost even within the first week. And the Germans advance to the suburbs of Leningrad and Moscow. Further south, they've taken Kiev and they've pressed along the north coast of the Black Sea through under the Crimea and get to the northeastern shore of the Black Sea at a place called Rostov. On December 5th, in spite of those enormous losses, the Soviets launch a counterattack, which drives back the German army, particularly from the environs of Moscow, by nearly 100 miles. Losses are devastating to both sides in this counterattack, and temperatures occasionally reach -40. Now that's, if you do the math, that's actually the same for centigrade and Fahrenheit. All right, so you can experience that if you want to go up on the top of Mount Washington in a winter storm and be in front of the wind blowing and so on. It's enormously cold. And frostbite occurs literally within minutes of that. Yet fighting goes on. While the Germans are pressed back, they do not collapse completely, largely due to Hitler's insistence that there be no retreats, that the German army is going to retreat, it's going to dissolve into chaos, they're going to be destroyed. So he has them create what they call breakwaters, which is where they hold villages, towns, other places where they can at least get warm periodically. And the Russians flow around them, but because of their logistical problems and so on, cannot destroy those German units. In the spring, the Russians launch another offensive near the town of Kharkiv. This is what we call today Kharkov back then. And they penetrate the German lines, but they're blocked eventually. And actually, a number of their units are wrecked completely because right at that particular moment, the Germans had been planning an attack of their own. And this attack in 42 leads to Stalingrad, and it leads further south into the Caucasus. And it looks as though the Germans are close to taking the oil that is vital to the Soviet army and its economy. But as we know, as November approaches in 42, the Russians again launch a massive counterattack, which encircles the Sixth Army at Stalingrad and eventually causes the chaotic retreat of the German forces in the Caucasus in order to prevent them being cut off entirely. Some of those units retreat into the what's called the Kuban Peninsula, which is right across the water from Crimea. Others make it to the southern areas of Ukraine, and eventually the Russians are stopped. But again, the losses to both sides are enormous. And it's a particular issue to look at the comparison of 41, when the Germans advanced on a very broad front, what they did in 42, where they had to isolate just the southern half of the Eastern Front in order to launch a major offensive. And that's an indication of the weakening of the German army between 41 and 42. When we get into 43, there's a bulge in the front near the city of Kursk. And in this situation, again, the Germans are not quite ready to give up offensive operations. And they decide that they want to pinch off this particular bulge and destroy the Russian armies that exist within it. As a result, compared to even 42, the geographic scope of the German army offensive is limited compared to what it was in the preceding 2 years. Again, a reflection of the weakening of the German army, but at the same time, a persistence in the aggressiveness that they're showing in the Eastern Front. Yes.
When did the T-34 tank get launched on the Eastern Front?
Right in the beginning of the conflict, 1941.
It was there from the
It
get-go.
was there from the get-go, and then it was upgunned and upgraded from a 76 millimeter to a more powerful weapon as they went on. And also they had the KV-1, which is a heavy tank, which was practically indestructible to most of the German weaponry until the 88 was used against it. The offensive against Kursk collapses within days, just within days. Again, a reflection of the weakening of the German army and a correlation with the improvement in the Russians in spite of their losses over these time periods, which again had been enormous. So by the end of 43, the Russians have really pushed the Germans back considerably. And indeed, the only place the Germans really have held on to from their initial gains from 41 were in the environs of Leningrad. The rest of the front had been pushed back several hundred miles. And one of the key things that I want us to keep in mind, which is very difficult, because again, we're not as familiar with the geography and the location of all these various towns and things which will be mentioned, is to try to think of it in this regard. How far is it from Binghamton to Owego? It's about 20 miles, right? Now, if you were to drive down that road, what I want you to think about is not how far forward you're going. I want you to look out the window, if you're not driving, and look at the terrain you pass over that 20 miles. And just think of what it would mean to defend or attack that area, particularly because you have the river as a major issue. So if you're defending, let's say you're on the south side of the river and you're looking across the river and you're thinking, I want to defend against 20 miles of some attacker coming at it. Or conversely, I have to cross the river and I have to attack into that terrain. Now extend it out to Elmira, or extend it out to Corning, and go even further until you have covered literally nearly 1,000 miles.
Chicago.
And you are the responsible top person for managing that and handling the resources. That's what the senior commanders of the German army, which includes Adolf Hitler, because he is the senior commander. He's in a sense like our commander-in-chief as president. He's got to be looking at that entire landscape. And what does it take to appreciate what's going on and be able to manage it? Conversely, look at it from Stalin's standpoint. Again, the senior military commander in charge of the entire Soviet function. And think about what you're going to do and how you're going to allocate resources, how you're going to decide to defeat the Germans in particular, although they still have Romanians and Hungarians hanging around for a while. We'll see what happens to them. And in the course of this, also consider that from the Soviet standpoint, now that you're into this war from 41, we're now going to get into 44, the losses you have sustained in men and materiel. Because in spite of what many historians talk about as the infinite resources of manpower that the Soviet Union has, by no means is it infinite. And we'll talk a little bit about that at another point. So that brings us to the Eastern Front in 1944. I have talked about this a bit in the last session we had, but I want to recover it because without this background in mind, what happens in 1944 will just simply be a lot of information with no substance really behind it, okay? It also emphasizes, particularly in 1944, much more even than 1945, in my opinion. And remember, a lot of what I tell you about is my interpretation of what is going on in this particular period of time and why things have unfolded the way they have. But in this particular situation, why the Eastern Front, to me, was the definitive theater of war. If, and it's a big postulate, if Germany had either been able to achieve its strategic goals in 41 and cause the Soviet Union to seek peace, as happened in 1917, when the Russian Empire made peace with the Germans and Austro-Hungarian Empire, if that had happened, what would the rest of the war look like? But instead, we have this amazingly destructive conflict. And despite the enormous losses both sides sustained, the Russians much more than the Germans, to me, if this hadn't been going on, the whole rest of the war would have been totally different. And I think it would have been unlikely for us to have a successful invasion of France, even in 44. Yes.
I would submit that the Germans and Russians did have peace up to June 22nd of 1941.
Yes, they did.
And it was one side that actually tilted it out of the peace environment.
It did as the attack, but neither side trusted the other. There's some evidence to suggest at the very least that Stalin wanted to not get into an armed conflict with Germany until 1942 or 43. It's not clear that he actually had specific plans, but the whole trajectory of the buildup of the Soviet military prior to that particular time of 1939 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that led to the division of Poland was geared towards saying, you guys, the Nazis, or if you're the Nazis looking at the communists, are ideologically incompatible with our worldview. That was the first element. The second element was a racist view. The Slavs are subhuman and don't deserve the recognition that Aryans deserve. And thirdly, we want your land. The land that we wish to have and colonize is not to the west, it's to the east. And in so doing that, we have these three major goals. Remember that in the 1920s and 30s, the primary philosophy of communism was that it was to be a worldwide structure. The whole development, and I don't want to get back into those discussions, but I do need to highlight it. The view, particularly by Churchill, was that communism was perhaps the second greatest threat to the world, to the so-called Western or liberal or democratic world, however you want to describe it. And the rise of Nazism was seen as the primary immediate threat. But he never, ever gave up on the idea that communism represented a global threat that was of enormous importance to how everything was going to be structured. You had a question, Stephen?
Yeah, was there in Russia an individual, perhaps like the Minister of Industrial Weapon Production, that was key in building the tanks and other, artillery and other weaponry needed? That's one question. And number two, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that for much of the beginning years, that production was very low. And then I'm kind of understanding that at some point, I don't know when, it was like the switch was flipped and all of a sudden they went into massive high production. Does any of that make sense?
Yes, and there was no single person that I can identify offhand who was the Minister of Production, the way there was designated the War Plans Division in the United States that helped coordinate the entire economy, or Beaverbrook, I think it was in England, who helped take care of the munitions there as the senior most important person next to Churchill, if you will. The production issues, just to deal with it very quickly, and then we can move on to this complex topic, is that the Soviets had, according to most historians now with access to recent figures, and even some of the German publications at the time, estimated the Soviets had 25,000 tanks, well outnumbering the German number, and were, while not technically sophisticated in terms of their armament, including their main guns, were far superior to the German. Far superior, which led to the production of the Panther tank and later the Tiger and the upgunning of the Mark IV and the upgunning of the Mark III on the German side. There was a drop in production when the first 6 months of the war occurred because the Russians, the Soviets, were very rapidly displacing factories further and further towards the Ural Mountains to try to get them out from being captured by the oncoming Germans. So there was a delay, but they literally set up factories on open platforms in the Urals in order to keep production going. So by the end of the war, if you look at the numbers of aircraft the Soviets built themselves, the tanks they built themselves, the numbers are absolutely staggering, especially when you consider how many losses they had sustained in manpower and the territory in production energy sources that they lost in the first 6 to 12 months of the fighting. So it was an incredible achievement, and it shows what modern countries are capable of doing. I've used these examples before, and I'll mention it again, though I'm not going to get into it today the way I have in the past. If you look at the conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, just as an example. Look up their populations and compare the population of the Russian Federation to the population of the Soviet Union in 1940. They're not that enormously different. It's a difference of about 30 million or so, which given the time frame is really surprisingly not a lot. Now that doesn't get into the demographics and the rest of it that have to do with aging and things of that nature. But consider that by this time of the war, 1944, the Soviet Union had lost probably close to 12 to 15 million. So you're talking, this is civilian and military. But you need a civilian workforce in order to run factories, right? So you have to take into account that out of the residual population, you're talking about the old, the AARP group,
Us.
or the young, age 12 and under. Because if you were 13, 14, and 15, you were working.
Did women fight on the front?
Absolutely, but not in large numbers. They function primarily as pilots, especially at nighttime, to do recon and go annoy the opposing units by dropping small bombs on their billets. They served anti-aircraft units. There's an excellent Russian film that deals with that. And I think it's called All Is Quiet at Dawn. It's a very interesting film. And they also had some designated combat battalions, but they generally were few in number, and they also had a fair number of excellent snipers who achieved remarkable numbers of kills. You were going to say something, Greg? I thought. No? Okay.
I thought your numbers were low.
Well, I'm talking by 44.
I know.
You
I
think it
know.
was even higher?
I think it's higher.
Oh, well, the total losses, just to give you an estimate, by the end of the war, it's estimated the Soviet Union lost 20 to 23 million. You think it's even higher?
Yes.
Okay, and it could well have been because so many go uncounted.
How many did they start out with, like before the war? How many Russians were there?
There were approximately, well,
Who's so many?
Soviets,
So,
because you have to consider how they designate, it was about 195 million. Yes,
It's never been really discussed, and I would ask you to address it. That the contribution of the Germans to the Russian industrial success was they never built a heavy bomber. They never had anything other than a 2-engine Condor, and they could not reach the Urals.
correct. That gets into a topic of great interest because the contrast that you're raising, Robert, is with the British and the American strategic bombing initiatives and the Americans against the Japanese. There's a lot of question that remains about how effective that really was and whether under the German approach to war, whether strategic bombing was an essential. And remember, every country, regardless how big, how powerful your industry is, still has finite resources. You have to allocate. And when eventually we get to the invasion of Normandy, I'll try to highlight that in considerable detail. There was another question? Yes.
So a couple years ago on History Channel, there was a series called War Factories.
Yes.
And if you type in YouTube, Soviet war production of World War II, you can see War Factories episode 8, and it's all about Russia's war production.
Oh, very good.
And I vaguely remember it, those people that were pushed into the Urals to build factories and stuff, they were like starving, they were being fed, they weren't getting heat, they weren't getting housing, they were just like out in the middle of the plains, working 24/7, and they were virtually dying themselves, so that, I found that very interesting.
Yeah, and you ask yourself, given our sense of comfort nowadays, and I'm not disparaging it, I'm glad that we have the resources to do it and can, control shift work and keep people safe and so on, because you learn nothing other than that people get tired, there are accidents and things like that. But yeah, these people were willing to go above and beyond by far. Yes,
They were
Did they-
assaulting,
I'm sorry.
Stalingrad. They were actually producing tanks as the Germans were assaulting the factory.
That's correct. They were actually driving them off the assembly line and sending them into battle.
Did they use prisoners of war?
Sorry, I'm
Did
sorry.
they use, did the Russians use prisoners, German prisoners of war in those factories?
Not in the factories. They used them elsewhere. Road building, rebuilding what road, it had to be done was really the primary function. They might use them in harvesting and things of that sort. And that was something that was allowed under the Geneva Convention. But we're gonna come to that a little bit more. As I mentioned, one of the things that is notable is, unlike in the conflict with Britain and the United States, if you were a POW, you didn't expect to get home. Very few did. Out of all those captured at Stalingrad, as an example, there were over 95,000 captured. It's estimated only 5,000 ever got home. The rest died.
We don't usually talk about it, but after the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the Germans have been prohibited from, actually even before that, the Germans have been prohibited for making tanks and things like that.
Right.
The Soviets allowed them to do that in the Soviet Union, to practice, to use some of their tanks. The Russians got to see what the Germans had in tanks
Yeah.
and built better.
Well, there's two elements to that too. That actually started in the 20s. When the German army after World War I was limited to 100,000. So pretty much everybody who was in the German army had to be officer capable, even if you weren't designated as an officer, because you weren't allowed to have them. So you developed other means of getting around. In order to create armor, which was prohibited by the Versailles Treaty, the Germans made an arrangement with the Russians and worked on their technology. They also did it with their aircraft. Although they developed glider clubs in Germany in order to train pilots, because they were prohibited from having a true air force. And the same elements figured into submarines and things of that nature. Once Hitler established himself in power, however, he brought many of those resources back to Germany itself. And just said the Versailles Treaty no longer functions. I'm going to do a lot of my own productions at home. What is interesting, and you mentioned this, Greg, and I think it's critical, is that while the Germans had the opportunity to build and study, develop blitzkrieg tactics as we hear about them in our popular lingo today, the Russians learned a great deal from the Germans, and as a consequence, built better tanks in terms of at least their armor and their weaponry, which surprisingly caught the Germans off guard in 41 when they invaded. They just didn't realize what the Germans had. I mean, the Russians had at that point. The second part is that part of the technology the Russians used to great advantage was actually an American technology. There was a fellow named Christie who developed a particular type of tank, and particularly the wheel system that was used to propel the treads. And the United States rejected that for our army. The Russians found it eminently useful and incorporated it into nearly all of their tanks with great success. So again, these issues, as you mentioned, are extraordinarily complex. Any other questions?
Yeah,
Yes.
I've always been fascinated by the so-called German engineering scientific prowess.
Yes.
What do you think was behind that? Was it their university system? Was it their K through 12? Was it their mothers? I mean, teaching their children, all of the above, none of the above? I'm just curious about.
Well, it actually goes back well into the late 1700s and 1800s, and without trying to address all of that particular history, which I find fascinating in itself. German technology had been recognized for literally decades, if not a couple of centuries, for its prowess. And that's partly related to not just the university system, but it has to do with a lot of other institutional characteristics. The German technology particularly advanced up to and through a good part of World War I, but with interesting gaps. But the technological expertise, the knowledge base remained. So it's a little bit like saying, I may not know physics anymore, as Robert can attest. I have some questions for you at the very end of the lecture, by the way. Related to going to a library and finding the information and having a resource supported by a company or by an institution, including the government, that says, we think this is valuable and we're going to fund it. The paradox of things, and I have to admit to not understanding this very well at all, is when you look at the economic collapse that occurred in Germany in the 20s with hyperinflation, and then the Great Depression, which actually affected Germany less severely than it did the more Western countries like France, Britain, and Germany, and actually affected Russia practically not at all, which was a surprise. They still managed, and to me, it's just extraordinary. Now, the Germans often tended to over-engineer as well. So in many ways, they became craftsmen rather than the kind of assembly line production you saw for the T-34 or for many of the aircraft like the Sturmovik and the Yak fighters and things that the MiG fighters, or that happened in the United States. They tended to over-engineer. But in the beginning, in spite of the lack of suitable armor and weaponry on their tanks, their technology gave them an advantage through the use of radios, which they put in every tank, whereas the Russians did not do that.
Because I've worked with a handful of German engineers as well as engineers from probably a dozen different countries. And I know it's just a few anecdotal data points, but they didn't seem to be all that more brainy than, say, an engineer from Israel or from India or Pakistan. But yet, at the end of the war, from what my understanding, it was a land grab, if you will, of between the Soviets and us to grab as many of the German rocket scientists as possible.
Right.
Which I guess the guy, was it von Braun, that basically invented our Saturn V that led to Apollo.
Right.
So I know it's a big question, but I'm just always curious about what made their engineers and scientific efforts so successful compared to us. I mean, they were ahead of us in many areas.
Well, again, I'm going to defer anything there because this topic gets fairly complex as well. But these are excellent questions, and I would very much like to address them with you. But also, just in consideration, think of how the superior in some ways the Japanese were, who had even a shorter span of time in which to develop the technology and understanding and creativity that you see. And that comes to a whole different issue there. Let me start with this, just so that we capture some of the effects. Now, some of these slides, and the maps in particular, are going to be very difficult And I'm trying to give you a broad view. I don't care about the details. If I could remove a lot of the scribble on there, I would. But what this shows you is the Eastern Front as it existed roughly at the end of 1943, when combat operations tended to wind down. Now, I'm going to try to do this without creating a disaster. The front line, and if you look at the legend up in the upper left corner, you'll see there, that's in terms of scale of kilometers, right? But just consider measuring from Leningrad, follow the red line down and then the dotted line before you come into the purple, state of the East, all right? All the way down there, you'll see that that is an enormous distance, okay? We're talking 1,000 miles plus. Okay, 1,000 miles. So New York to what? Charleston? Somewhere in that framework. You're responsible for that entire area. You'll notice also the kind of funnel shape that you get as you move from Leningrad, which is in a very top part of that circle, down towards where you'll see the red block that says center. You'll see that as the front moves west, you have a narrowing. This is directly opposite what the Germans faced when they were attacking from west to east. They were opening the funnel, which meant a greater front line had to be covered, which meant your resources are stretched even more. What's happening here is just the opposite. You're consolidating. So as we consider the enormous losses that are being taken by both sides, as they're driven back, the front line is shortening. And as the front line shortens, that means fewer resources are needed to hold it. Down in the lower portion, you'll see the Black Sea and you'll see Crimea has been cut off. The 7th Army, German 7th Army with Romanian troops is trapped there. We'll come to that in just a moment. What is not shown on this map is the whole part of Finland from Leningrad to the far north. And there were German and Finnish troops up there along with Russian troops. So this is yet another theater of conflict that I talked about in previous areas. And in particular, you'll notice at the very top on that line between letters B and C, that Leningrad is still invested by 44. So it's been under siege from basically July of 41 until December/January of 44. And as those of you who may have seen the famous book, The 900 Days, that talks about the siege of Leningrad and perhaps 1 million people dying there, a lot of them from starvation, not from combat losses. And how that was maintained, how Leningrad could be maintained. What is not shown there is that there was another enclave just to the west called Oranienbaum. And it was the site of a Russian naval base, which was kept secure from being taken by the Germans and remained there as an enclave until this particular time. Now, what is happening elsewhere in the world is something we're not going to discuss right at this moment. But I'm going to go to the Finnish front because the Soviets finally have the resources. They finally have the training that is needed to really hammer the Germans in 1944. And that's why I call this the year of decision, because once you see what happens in 1944, it's a done deal. 45 is merely the end. It's what it costs to get there, truly. But 44, that's taken victories off the map for everybody on the losing side. In this situation, 2 major attacks are launched. One just north of Leningrad, which is down in the lower left part of that slide, and the other across an isthmus that is where the Finns had advanced past their 39 borders after the conclusion of their conflict with the Soviet Union in 1939 and 40. And now the Soviets are going to advance through there. One of the things to look at a little bit carefully in the slide is how much water there is. That area is low-lying and has enormous amounts of swampland and lakes and streams and everything else. So fighting in this area is extremely difficult. Just try to walk from one place to another, and you could see that if you're not on a roadway, it becomes almost physically impossible. And yet they're able to do it. Now, how are they helped? Well, this is January, so things are frozen. All right, that helps. You can walk across ice. So one of the reasons for launching the attacks when you do has to do with breaking through this area. But once the weather breaks, everything else begins to shut down. It becomes extraordinarily hard to move. So when this attack occurs, it's designed to take whatever advantage you can of the weather to disrupt the Finns and force them back to the borders that were established in 39. And the Soviets are successful in doing that. This is just another example. And even in spite of this being the summertime now, they're able to find their way through. The Finns by this point have been so weakened by all of the fighting that's gone on and never gets much attention, that at this particular time, the Finns are screaming for help from the Germans. They're saying, we're done if you can't send us stuff. And Hitler has no resources to send it. So what happens, and this again is part of the political issues that become critical. The Finns end up suing for peace. Now, if you're Stalin, and this is another part of your advance, back up to the 1940 borders that concluded the Russian-Finnish War, that particular time. You have Finland in your grasp, you can crush it. Okay. Why not keep going? Isn't that normally what you do when you've got the enemy on the ropes? Especially when they're already saying to you, we're done. I mean, we have no defense anymore. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. In the far north, when you're getting up near the Arctic Circle, again, major fighting has occurred back and forth with little gain because the terrain is so atrocious. That what happens here is when the Finns finally do sue for peace, and Stalin agrees to it. Okay. He says, you now have to get the Germans out of the rest of Finland. That means you're going to turn on them, or you'll give them at most 2 weeks to get out. So that means skedaddle. And in the north, where again the terrain is terrible, as you see up in here, the terrain again is swampy, wet, miserable stuff. Where are the Germans going to go? Norway. Because the very northern tip is controlled by Germany. They control all of Norway since 1940. So they can get back there and try to hold that ground. And as they have to retreat over these long distances, there are some small clashes that take place between the Finns and the Germans, but they're very much more in a prodding, you know, get out of here, get out of here. Why does Stalin accept the peace agreement? Because he doesn't want to keep fighting up there. It consumes resources that he'd rather have elsewhere. So once the Germans have been pushed out and the Finns have now basically surrendered, he doesn't have to go occupy the entire country. So I'll leave that for later, right? Remember, Sweden is neutral, okay? So they're not going to get in the middle of this as well. The reason that I point these numbers out, though, has to do with how we, as individuals here in the United States, particularly in this time frame, don't understand what these numbers really mean. And as you can see here, 113,000 to 45,000, 2,000 artillery. I mean, to think of that is like 2,000 artillery, and that's just on one small part of the front. The enormity of production is mind-boggling in my mind. So by the end of 44, basically it's all quiet on the Finnish front. Now, again, to talk about the complexity of operations. All these different initiatives that you see listed here have to do with all of the complex planning that it takes to figure out where you want to strike, when you want to strike, what resources you need to have there, what your opponent has, so that you can be superior in the areas that matter. And that these areas represent particular goals that are important to your conduct of the war. The most critical one that we'll talk about after our break is this one. But I want you to notice that in terms of what's going on, operations from the standpoint of the Soviets are going to continue almost without pause in various places along that huge 1,000-mile front. They're going to strike here, they're going to strike there, they're going to come back and shift resources and hit here. And that kind of complex planning is an enormous development compared to the way the Soviets conducted the war in 41 and even in 42. In other words, they were learning. And in spite of the enormous losses they were taking, they were becoming better and better at what they were doing, and they could overmatch the Germans. Many of the histories written by Germans indicate that it's always a predominance of numbers. But as you'll see from some of the things that I'll point out, the disparity is not that great in many ways. But it also has to do with how you bring resources from one place to another to achieve the superiority that you want. So when we look at numbers, it's not static. It's not that, gee, they had 1 million people here and 500,000 here. Well, when the 1 million guys start, finish fighting, they would shift resources down to that 500, and they'd have another 1 million that looked like down there, you see. And those kinds of things are ignored by most of our histories. It also means that when you're looking at maps, it gets very confusing. All right. January to December, this gives you a rough idea of how much terrain was lost in 1 year. Now, again, it's not a matter of you looking at the different locations and say, where's this city, where's that city, and so on and so forth. But what I do want to point out is that Moscow is right here, okay? The Germans had gotten within miles of Moscow in 41. So by the time we're here, at the end of 43, the Germans have been forced back. Here's Leningrad, and the Germans are still there. The Germans down here had taken Kiev in 41, and they had gone way off map, all the way over to Stalingrad, which was about the edge of the screen, and then way down off screen into the Caucasus. So that front line was enormous, but then it collapsed within a very short period of time. And eventually, after Kursk, and Kursk is right here, after the Battle of Kursk in July of 43, the Germans are forced all the way back to here. And you'll notice this is Crimea. It's been cut off, and the German 7th Army is down there. The Russian planning, I break it down in terms of location rather than particular times because it becomes very difficult to follow. So we're going to talk about Army Group North. We'll talk a bit about this, and then we'll come back to the center portion here of Army Group Center. But I've listed what I believe are the main axes of attack that are important to this particular year. The fighting around Leningrad remember, the Germans had been there since 41. So they developed a great extensive defensive set of lines that they could fall back on if they were facing an overwhelming attack. They had been unable to take Leningrad for a variety of reasons. And the fighting along this particular front, while it had been vicious at different times, had really been relatively static, almost World War I-like in nature. But now that was all going to change. As you see here, the partisans number of 35,000, you've got 35,000 people running around back here, disrupting your supply lines, blowing up your roads, shooting messengers, attacking supply trucks and rail lines and so on. But you're bringing together 1 million soldiers and 1,200 fighting vehicles, 1,500 aircraft. Now, you'll notice that I don't have much up here in terms of numbers for the Germans, and that's because the numbers are a bit vague in some of the histories. But basically, there were probably no more than 500,000 up here, 500,000 covering this entire area and further down, because down through here is still part of Army Group North. And they had relatively few armored vehicles. By this time, the Germans were having great difficulty with production of tanks, so they created something called an assault gun, which was like a turretless tank with the gun built into the chassis. So it was somewhat lower in height, which meant it could hide a little more, but it didn't have quite the same flexibility that you got with a tank with a turret. So this was their defensive lines. And the Soviets arranged a complex attack. Again, everything looks like it's a frontal assault, but that's because we're dealing at such a large scale that everything looks to be as though it's just going into the teeth of defenses. But this was not the case operationally. What this shows you is that over the period of nearly a year, the attacks against Army Group North were going to have considerable repercussions, and we're going to relieve the siege of Leningrad quickly. This is just the organization. I just show this. The trouble with using numbers like 44 infantry divisions and for the Soviets 57 is that these are very different constructs. And what a German infantry division would look like if it was at full complement in 1944 was not necessarily the case in reality. So as we look at maps and we see these blocks that talk about divisions or corps or even armies, there's a real hollowness to many of the German units. Similarly, Russian divisions tended to be about 2/3 the size of German units if they were at full complement. And the whole internal structure is also very different. So try not to just use divisions and divisions as a measure of what's going on, nor can you even just look at numbers of men or fighting vehicles and things of that sort, because when you get into the weeds, those are very, very different. And in fact, it's reflected in the casualty rates that you'll see. Yes.
Could you go back to slides? I've got a question on Leningrad.
This one?
Okay, the investment right there.
Yes.
You can see the German line. Leningrad was supplied in the winter over Lake Ladoga.
Correct.
Why couldn't the Germans have moved, it looks like 1/4 of an inch further up and cut off Leningrad from Lake Ladoga?
There were two reasons that happened. One is that Russian resistance, particularly in the area that you may have seen it on a map, there's a little town called Mga, M-G-A. And there's another one, Tikhvin, which is right on the lowermost coast of Lake Ladoga. They actually took those temporarily and cut them. But the lake itself is a barrier. You can't do much about that.
But there's a land bridge between Leningrad and Lake Ladoga.
That only, you're talking about between here and there?
Yeah,
All right, the distance there is actually very small.
yeah.
And the Germans were trying to invest, but they felt if they got to the lower reaches of Lake Ladoga, that cut off the rail lines and would allow Leningrad to starve. Similarly, the Finns had come down and had cut off the northern land line, if you would call it. So the land line to Leningrad was not broken until very late. And what was used in the winter was called an ice bridge, where they literally laid railroad tracks across Lake Ladoga and brought trains across, and obviously light trains. And then, of course, if you got into the spring or you had a period of thaw, all of that is going to collapse and die. But then as you get into the warmer weather, where it's now a lake, now you're bringing boats and barges across. And the Germans worked very hard to try to interdict all that. But remember, their resources in the north are being shifted to the center. And then in 42 to the south, because they've got that drive towards Stalingrad and down to the Caucasus. And again, how do you change your resources? The Finns never wanted to push beyond their original 1939 borders. And so they came down to their old border line and said, we're stopping here. We're not going to come down and link directly with the German forces. So that's why they were never cut off completely, as you mentioned.
Thank you.
You bet. Now, as the attacks develop, the important part of all of this is just to try to understand what is actually happening here. The red arrows tend to give us an idea, but more importantly, it's what the operational goals are going to be. So the first operational goal is relieve Leningrad. And these attacks here are designed, there's Magog, you want to push the Germans back so you can open the line and get an overland route to Leningrad. The second part is you want to create a connection between this enclave that I mentioned earlier and Leningrad. You want to link this up. So now you have a coherent line of communications back and can supply everything overland rather than having to transship through Lake Ladoga. You're pushing back, as I mentioned earlier. Remember, this is January and March, and I mentioned about winter attacks through here and up here, the Karelian Peninsula. But the real thing that you want to do, and this was their operational design, is to use these two fronts to drive down through here and drive through here and trap the German 16th and 18th armies that are up in this area. These are core structures here. You want to trap them here because then they can't get back across this water bridge. Or if they get across, they're not going to have anything much to bring with them. So operationally, that's it. But this is also part of that area, and they're going to put pressure down here, which is called the Panther Line, as best they could, so that eventually they can get into Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. Go to the next slide. This gives you a rough idea of the strength. And I also want to mention, be very careful about interpreting these numbers. First, of accuracy. Secondly, of the combat effectiveness is really a better way to think about this. How effective are these units in combat? And therefore, you'll see as the attackers, even though, I'm sorry, let me go back one. Even though it looks like this is a big predominance compared to this, look at the total casualties that you're dealing with. Now, again, even if these are gross approximations, they give you an idea of how intense the fighting has been. And this is just over 3 months. Okay, 3 months, one section of the Eastern Front, one section. Now compare that, for example, to all of World War II dead in the United States. We had maybe estimates go from 400,000+ to 600,000. Let's take the highest number, 600,000 dead. This is just one small section for a limited time frame. And both sides are sustaining this on a regular basis. I brought this up because this highlights something again important about how the German army was losing this war. So just in terms of materiel, notice this, 32 tanks. And this is one limited battlefield, right here, all right? Although it takes place over several months, the point is this is not a big area, right? 32 tanks, 137 aircraft. Now, they have 2,500 assault guns and 100 tanks, and this has to do with what an assault gun is. We're not going to worry about it. Losses, 235,000 wounded or sick, 65,000 dead. Another small piece of this front line. Now, Army Group North begins to collapse as they're falling back. Now, that last slide dealt with this area up here, just this little segment, but look how much of Army Group North still is involved in fighting. And as the Russians advance, they break through the Panther Line, which is here, and they begin to drive into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, there are German forces all along here, but look at this. Not much distance if the Russians can get to Riga. And these guys are not going anywhere. So if you're Hitler, what do? What do you tell these guys to do?
No retreat.
You have two choices. You can stay and fight and die here, but if the Russians get here, you're done. You can be supplied by sea, but this is very, very difficult. So the other thing is to try to retreat. Now, if you're the commander of Army Group North, what do you want to do? You want to get out of here. You want to stay linked up to the rest of the main German army. And this is part of the contention that normally develops, because if you start a massive retreat through here, what kind of congestion is going to develop in this area as you try to take thousands of people and vehicles out of this area? And are the Russians going to sit by idly and say, oh, well, we'll see you now that you're leaving? Heck no. Get after them. Punish them. Because remember, the Russians had been punished similarly in 41. So this is retribution big time. So yes.
What was the allegiance of the Baltic states early in the war versus late in the war? Because they weren't exactly pro-Russian. Were they welcoming the Nazis to some extent?
Well, when you go back to the 1939, when Poland falls, the Russians occupied the eastern half of Poland, and the Germans have the western half. Now, the Russians had worked with the Germans in terms of strategic interests. And theoretically, the three Baltic states were to be independent. And Stalin said, nah. So we'll just take them. So they became under the authority of Stalin. So they weren't happy about that. They weren't happy. When the Germans initially arrived, as happened in Ukraine, they were initially welcomed. They thought, great, now we can get out from under Stalin's thumb. But the treatment of the people there was such that they said, bro, we got to choose between Stalin and Hitler. That's a terrible choice they have to make. Now, some would side with one side, some would side with the other. But remember the number of partisans that I mentioned. And partisans were not Russians who were hiding in Estonia and Latvia. They were native people there. So when the Russians advanced, now they're caught not just between a rock and a hard place, but the attitude Stalin had towards countries that had been taken by the Germans and occupied by the Germans, particularly for several years, was, you're no friend of mine. So you're going to either do exactly what I tell you, you're going to join the army, you're going to do all these different things, or we're just going to get rid of you. Because he had no compunction about killing people, none. And people forget that. This guy killed anybody that he thought was not on his side. And even people on his side, he killed. Yes, Steve?
So when in the war did the Allies begin to seriously supply the Soviets with armaments and whatever, boots,
Yep.
equipment and so forth? And was that supply meaningful?
Yes, 1942, because once we'd been attacked and Britain had basically been able to sustain itself and beat back the German onslaught that we thought might lead to the collapse. And the reason I say 42 as well is that up until December of 41, both the Americans and the British thought the Soviets were done. They thought they were finished. They were going to lose. And it wasn't until the Russian offensives that we ended up saying, gee, they've got a chance. So now we can supply them. But we honestly thought in those first 6 months, they were done.
So what we're talking about here is 2 years after.
Right.
The Allied supply chains were
Right.
developed. They came in from the north.
Well, we sent them through a lot of different locations. The northern route was one, the Murmansk route as it was called. But we also sent them through the Near East and Middle East. And that, again, was one of the reasons why there was this complex strategic view for the Germans of coming across North Africa and taking Suez and maybe eventually getting into Syria and Iran and cutting off that southern supply
So
route.
that would have been all worked out between FDR and Churchill.
And Stalin and,
And then,
yeah, exactly. And part of the issue was that our supply to them that mattered the most to them was food and trucks.
Studebaker trucks.
Yeah, the trucks were the key. Now, as Army Group North is collapsing, you have these strategic decisions that have to be made. And eventually, what happens is that the Army Group North is able to retreat out of the trap that was present up here, but barely gets into this area, and here they're cut off from the rest of the German army. So Army Group North is now severed from the rest of the main German forces to its south. Remember the funnel effect that I talked about, all right? They're trying to get out of the funnel, and the Soviets are able to cut in and cut them off. There's a lot of fighting that goes on there, but basically until the end of the war, this particular group, no longer called Army Group North, becomes Army Group Courland of its location. This gives you an idea of, again, the numbers will look very different from place to place, but what I emphasize here is that as this particular part of the year ends, the Soviets have built up more and more forces. This is larger than the numbers I showed you earlier. And this is smaller than the numbers I showed you earlier. In other words, the Germans don't have replacements. They can't bring in more people. But as more territory is conquered by the Soviets, they'll also grab as many Estonians and Latvians and Lithuanians as they feel they need. And they basically say, you're joining the army, or else. And if you don't, you're dead. And And they say, but I'm not trained. They said, pick up weapons on the battlefield. Don't worry about it. Okay? Zhukov is even notoriously quoted as saying that when talking with Eisenhower about how they handled minefields, he said, we just sent men across it. We'll lose fewer casualties than trying to sit there and demine the place. So we just send people across. Well, who would you send? You'd send your penal battalions, right? The guys you care about the least. And if you make it to the other side of the minefield, well, maybe we'll be good to you. If you don't, so what? This gives you an idea of the losses. Now notice the disproportionate, because when you're attacking into defenses, you generally are going to take higher casualties as well. But what matters is that although you see here 522 tanks are lost, because you capture the battlefield, many of those tanks can be repaired. So it's not an absolute loss, not a categorical loss. Now, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes here, and then we're going to get to the other parts of this. I don't want to spend too much more time, or we'll run out. Through the first 4 months, the Western Ukraine also is freed up. And in January to March, again, despite terrible weather, the Russians continue to attack and pressure the Germans heavily. Now, the place that is most significant in this, the Korsun Pocket, I have a book over here called Hell's Gate, which I just have you thumb through. It's fascinating in terms of the details of this particular small fight. When I use the word small, has to do with the German units that become encircled near the Dnieper River here. And the Russians are able, the Soviets, are able to use two fronts to breach through the defenses that initially linked up and isolate this group of about 60,000. Hitler had wanted them to try to hang on, but it became clear in time that they were not going to be able to sustain this pocket, and they had to reconnect to the main German forces. Now, this looks like the Germans are incredibly powerful. These symbols are armor, right? These are all armored divisions, okay? Now, some of these, like the 16th you'll see here, and the 17th you'll see here, are repetitive. But the point is that armor, heavy tanks, assault guns, armored fighting vehicles, and so on, except again, these are relatively hollow forces in comparison to what the Soviets are putting together. So it looks as though the Germans should be able to break through, but as you can see, at every place they're stymied. The closest they can get to the pocket is at Lysychanka here, and these troops are told to break out and join up. Now, when I say the relief attempt nearly succeeds, is that you can't evacuate all of the heavy equipment out of here, all right? The distance between the two is very small, and this is just another example using a German map, but the idea behind it is to show this little stream here, which is where the Russians are able to block any heavy equipment from getting out. And basically, the only people who are able to get out have to cross this particular river in winter with very little personal equipment and no bridges. So in the middle of winter, you're a infantryman who's managed to struggle the miles involved from here to here with hard fighting all the way. You get to here, and now you've got to cross this barrier in winter with no bridges, no boats, no flotation devices. You swim. And what's waiting for you on the other side? There are no trucks. There are no ambulances. There are no wagons. You may have some friendly forces over there, but you've got to walk back to a town, dripping wet.
In winter.
It's hard to imagine. hard to imagine. And it was costly. This shows you roughly the losses that are involved. But notice that in spite of the relative success and predominance that you see here, the Soviets still lost a considerable number of people. In the pocket, 30,000 killed, captured. This is the relief attempts. These are the total casualties. And all heavy equipment is lost.
Michael,
Yes.
what kind of information were the people back in Berlin and Frankfurt getting about what was happening on the Eastern Front?
They were very aware. There's some very interesting books that deal with that by people who actually they have the actual conferences, the transcripts of conferences. And you have some of the senior generals who were on site, particularly a fellow named Warlimont, who wrote a book about that, Inside Hitler's Headquarters, 39 to 45. And it's a little bit of self-serving in its own way, but that's the nature of things. So they were very aware, very aware.
Not just the officers, but the populace.
The populace was given, and it's interesting, in one of the books that I put here on Ostfront, is you look at the communiques that are released by the government about this, and they talk about hard fighting and how they've inflicted heavy losses on the Soviets, and they've lost a little bit of ground here and there. Again, it's the same kind of propaganda everybody engaged in, including us. Yes.
I know in the First World War, the Germans published the names of those killed in action in newspapers. I don't know if they did the same thing in the Second World War.
I can't answer that, but quite honestly, I think they may have, because that was a fairly common technique even from the middle of the 1800s, like an American Civil War where we did that. But remember that you're seeing the casualty lists in this town or that town, and no one's running around putting them all together and saying, gee, look what we lost. And a good part of it was the propaganda with the loss of the 6th Army at Stalingrad and how they addressed that in order to keep the populace engaged, if you will. Remember also at this time, strategic bombing is having a huge effect on Germany itself, with the idea that you not only break the military industrial complex and the infrastructure required to support everything, but you want to demoralize the population. Didn't happen that way. Production continued. Morale stayed high enough. Why? Because particularly when you looked at the Soviets and the conduct of that war on that front, the fear was enormous. If the Soviets get to Germany, retribution is going to be awful. As it turned out, it was. Very different from fighting on the Western Front. So here, just an example that, again, think of the distance of 100 miles from here to Albany. If you drive from here to Albany, look at the terrain. Look at how am I going to defend all this? What about this valley here? What about this river here? Where do I sight these guns? How far deeply do I develop fortifications and things of that nature? It's an interesting mental exercise to put in perspective the kinds of things that are being developed here. In this particular situation, then, the Western Ukraine is falling. The Eastern Ukraine had already fallen. This is now the Western Ukraine is falling, and you're coming up to the borders with Poland here. Okay. And Hitler is looking at more and more losses of territory. Okay. Now, remember, this is before Normandy. Keep this in mind, because when you get to Normandy, you've got a whole different change in the strategic picture that's being developed here. So at this particular time, they're falling back, and down here is the Black Sea. All right, there's Odessa. Crimea is down here at the lower edge of the screen. And the Russians are continuing, the Soviets are continuing to drive back the German forces and threatening encirclements all through here. All right? So you've got to get out of Dodge. Now, what do you determine is going to be your next defense line? Goes back to the earliest days of warfare. You want a river line, right? You don't want to be out in the open. Either that or you want to be in mountains where they're very steep, difficult to traverse, and you can control the passes. But you've got to fall back. You can't just say, well, I'm going to go from here to here and fight here and stop them. No, you've got to find a river line. Now, how good is a river line? It's good only if you have fortifications to help defend it. Otherwise, it's just a matter of crossing a river. So it takes more resources to get you there. Steve, I'm going to ask you to wait for a minute until I get through. Is that all right? Okay. So with the collapse in Western Ukraine, again, more and more German units are being destroyed. You'll see here that this is a whole pocket that's actually trapped, but they managed to just break out, but again, losing a great deal of equipment. So while this looks like it's a core, in terms of battle strength, that might be a modern, they use a full complement division. And it's maybe 1/3 of what it would normally be worth. And again, the other part that's happening now is you're driving the Germans back and the Romanians back onto high ground. So they're looking at this, once this line is broken open, and look at this gap, right? Where there's practically no identifiable forces to stop you. As you can back into the mountains, maybe you can hold off the Russians or the Soviets at that point. The collapse of the Crimea is shown here. This army basically 250,000. I have as Germans, it's also about half Romanians are caught here, and they're driven back to Sevastopol very quickly, isolated. And the reason that they held on to Crimea, again, remember it got cut off in 43, the end of 43. I showed you that on a previous slide. Why did Hitler insist on holding the Ukraine? Because this, as far as he was concerned, was another unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the Russians or the Soviets could hit Ploesti in Romania. They were within easy bombing range. Why did Ploesti matter? Because that's where the oil is. If he loses Ploesti, his fuel stocks are going to become catastrophically low. So he asked them to hang on and hang on and hang on, and they're getting pummeled, and eventually it becomes clear that they're not going to make it. And this again gives you an idea of the relative losses that are occurring. I draw the attention here that Romania had a lot of folks in there, and they're dying as well. This is one of the places where the Soviet losses seem to be fewer than the Axis losses. Okay, stop it. The final offenses leading up to May 44, now you'll see that Romania is invaded. Okay, here's Crimea. Now they're into Romania, there's Bucharest. All right. And what you're going to see is that the Soviets are going to swing further north. Now, we don't see the lines going down here because Bulgaria sees the end of the war coming. And they decide that they're going to surrender as well. Yugoslavia is basically held by Tito. There are German forces here that have been conducting partisan warfare for several years. But it's pretty clear this is an unfriendly place to be. Hungary is still a good part of the German forces, politically as well as militarily. But very quickly, Hungary is going to be overrun except for this little city of Budapest. And there's going to be some terrible fighting that takes place there. Let's take a quick break. And then I'm going to come back and conclude through Operation Bagration what we'll say is the final crushing blow to the German army. Okay, we'll take just a few minutes and then come back. And for those of you who are in Zoom land, accept my apologies for the difficulties of the slides to show you highlights.
You were right, and, you can plug it in on everything, you can have your presentation on it. If you have the Zoom client, all you need is the Zoom client, I can use the word phone.
My father was with me, my.
I don't know if I have that, this guy, no, that's not that guy.
Quite often,
Yeah, I know, right.
there's some sort of, invasion or something.
Oh.
It became sort of a,
Really?
I was so young, I was shush up to bed. My sister was 5 years old.
Yes,
Yeah.
I
have on my desk.
I suspect so. My spring is going to break.
He couldn't stand not being
So,
outside.
Yeah, I think I can connect my laptop to the internet and then download the file. Is that how to do it? Gotcha. Okay. Now, here's.
And when you realize that, you know, we didn't have anything like that.
We haven't had the.
The information.
Probably
had to be-
Ethernet. I have yet to select it and buy it, but it'll be a Dell, it'll be a Dell laptop.
Carbon copy, because you didn't have Xerox. Yeah, carbon copy.
Ethernet connection. Yes,
Everybody's to understand what's being written down. You gotta take.
Yeah. I do have Wi-Fi, available, but I live across the border in PA and the internet isn't as reliable as up here in New York. But I think a hard Ethernet connection is a lot stronger, more reliable than Wi-Fi. That's been my experience.
It was contested between the,
So I'll make sure that when I select a model laptop.
when I used the German
Dell,
Dell,
make sure that it has an
too much
Ethernet.
of the, of an influence. They
To be able to connect directly.
Craft there, but
To
like
make
that
that
reason.
Exactly.
Soviets were not in control because of the air power that the Germans could use against them.
Okay.
So in
Okay, now,
41,
here
as
is my
they
real question.
drove in and entered the Crimea, the
The
Russian
subject
fleet
matter
had
of this
displaced out of Sebastopol,
that are
which was its
law
main base, and go to the eastern reaches of the Black Sea.
artificial
Those
intelligence.
are Soviets, I think, is one of the main present are.
Therefore,
And when the
most
Germans
of my
in 42 came down into the
will be-
Caucasus
Oh, well,
region,
nice when it's done.
audio file.
Yeah.
Soviets put up a staunch defense on the
So,
mountains to
I
protect
think
the
I
eastern
see some
coast,
speakers
so they would lose the
No,
entirely. If they lost the bases, the ships would be.
And with Woodbury, I don't know if you can-
But there were very few, I think there were a few German submarines. that
It sounds like you're a Mr. computer.
literally transported.
And I'm an engineer, I'm a geek too, so I say that
Because they couldn't go through Turkey, because remained neutral, so they couldn't get that one.
Oh, okay,
And the
okay.
Romanian
So
Navy
you,
and
so
the
you
Bulgarian
back
Navy
sense,
were relatively,
the,
you know, minor.
referring to you as,
So a lot of it.
as a fellow geek. Okay,
What
so,
you could.
all right, so you're familiar with MP3 files. I will have an MP3 file.
But there were no naval battles like you would see.
Well,
Really
probably
air
both,
battles.
if I can buy this laptop. and-
Yeah, when they
I'll have an
driven
MP3
back.
file
Back to the tip.
on my laptop and on my thumb drive.
Serious issue as to what.
What are you yakking about?
I will make sure that the
So you can get
laptop
some,
has Windows
even antiquated.
or some
planes up in the
other
air,
application
drop a couple of bombs.
that can play the audio file.
Bill, and the German Navy was provide
But
much
going
protection
outside
to the northern group.
inside.
Yes, again, they were mostly there for the use of transport,
Is
but
he running on his
because of
laptop?
their main surface fleets, they had some destroyers up there, destroyer escorts, but they didn't have the large work.
Okay, now you're.
But that's a resupply and evacuate.
they were able to do, and that's why the army.
That's not connected to anything. That's only business. But.
That was a bad run.
Oh, yeah, gotcha. So what's being, what's being purchased on the license.
That was sunk by, so with large losses.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have probably 4 or 5 slides.
Okay, people, let's resume, so we can finish up close to time, okay?
No military.
We'll talk afterwards.
And if, we can just kill the front lights again, please.
That'd be great.
As we go, the destruction of Army Group Center is one of the key features of the Eastern Front. And in some ways, again, in my view, given the condition of the German army at the time, that this was a much greater catastrophic loss than what most of us think about with Stalingrad, right? Where you had a total of over 300,000+ trapped, and then, as I mentioned, a lot of killed, and of the prisoners of war, none getting home. This was more catastrophic to Germany for a variety of reasons. This gives you an idea of what the situation was just before Operation Bagration begins. Bagration, by the way, was a Russian general during the Napoleonic period. And in this situation, you see that red line connecting the two big purplish blue colors.
Yeah.
And that represents the location of Army Group Center. Now, I'm going to blow that map up quickly for you here and show you the important issues. And I'm going to mention one particular important, or two particular important elements. The Berezina River here with the Pripyat marshes, which were considered almost impassable. And through this area here, you have some land that's not directly covered by rivers, but basically anything you're doing is going to involve you getting across rivers or working your way through swampland. This bulge was a prime target for the Soviets, and they mustered an enormous amount of combat power in order to address it. Now, again, remember, numbers are speculative in good many ways. I can't attest to the complete accuracy of these 493 combat personnel. But I just take what's given to me and modify it accordingly. But the important part here, and again, just to show you an example, 118 tanks. This is an army group. This is a huge mass of people, and you don't have tanks? Look at that. You've got 3,000 field guns and howitzers of various sizes compared to 32,000, so on and so on and so on. Now you're going to feed resources in there as this battle unfolds, which is why you see the numbers change, and different sources will give you different appreciations of what's going on. For example, here, he says, well, it's close to that 6,000 and so on. It just gives you an idea of the scale of events that's going on at this particular time. This again is just a blow up to show what Army Group Center looks like at this point. And this is now going to be launched on June 22nd, 1944. When did the Germans attack the Soviet Union? June 22nd, 1941. So 3 years later, on the same date, they're going to launch their assault on Army Group Center. And it is going to be as much a catastrophe for the German army as it was for the Soviet army. This shows you the main lines of attack. And the important part here is that over a period of just a couple months, June, July, into August, there's going to be catastrophic losses for the Germans, not just in terms of territory, but in terms of equipment and personnel. A blow from which I believe they never recovered. This goes back in part to show you just the development that was happening with Army Group North being cut off, and it ends up here in Courland, right? They got driven back here, got into Estonia, almost got trapped in Estonia, escaped through here, but because the Soviets had reached the coast at this location, Army Group North is now trapped, and Army Group South is facing the oncoming Soviets. These are just fortified regions where the Germans tried to hunker down and hold back the onslaught and generally were surrounded and captured. The Soviet attacks here look as though they're coming from all directions. Their prime areas of attack are really a line here and a line through here as you keep these front areas in mind. But the idea is this is just overwhelming. And notice that these marshes are actually assaulted by some of the Soviet forces because the partisans had lived heavily in this area and could provide the network of roads and tracks that you need to get through it. The Germans never really controlled the Pripyat area very well at all. Partisan warfare there was very intense. So the partisans could get coordinated and figure out where the Germans were and then help shepherd the oncoming Soviet forces through the roads and tracks and get them through the swampland. Again, a great degree of cleverness. The first opening attacks very quickly resulted in the isolation of a whole number of German forces. Here at Vitebsk, for example, down through here near Brobuzk. But you'll notice here, this little thing here, Pocket 1, these are all the units that are caught in Pocket 1. Here's another pocket. Now, these guys are all going to try to break out, but they're caught. That means that every road, every track that they're going to try to follow is going to be interdicted by Soviet forces who are going to work diligently to kill them all. And reading those histories, particularly in that book Ostfront that I have there, is a reflection of just how awful the situation was. And all you have to do is flip the script and go back to 41, and the Russians were experiencing the same thing. Groups that are initially intact begin to fragment more and more and more as the pressures increase on them, so that eventually you're down to very few guys just hanging together with no officers around. And some of the descriptions are that literally, as this front collapsed, guys here literally made hundreds of kilometer treks. We're talking, for every 100 kilometers, you're talking about 62 miles. So some of these treks were literally several hundred miles of guys just making their way back to the German lines. Because they've been cut off for all that period of time. And of course, they didn't have a lot of friends waiting for them as they made those treks. These are just some upgraded slides to show more detail of what's going on and some of the important areas that were going to be addressed. And again, try to not look at all the little arrows as where all the fighting occurs, but rather the bigger trajectory of how the lines are broken and the major sites of attack along routes like this that will lead you up eventually to the outskirts of Warsaw here. Now, I talked about Warsaw last series and the fighting that went on there. The reason that the Soviets stop here is largely political, not just logistics. In other words, when you're traveling all of this distance, you have to bring every piece of equipment, fuel, food, clothing, replacement parts, everything else has to be brought along in order to allow those frontline units to keep fighting. But the Germans are being forced back so fast that it would seem as though the Soviets could very quickly have invested Warsaw, gotten around it and isolated it. Instead, they stopped right on the outskirts. That was a political decision. Why? Because Stalin had an objective in mind that he wanted to eliminate any Polish resistance to Soviet rule once the war was over. Stalin was always thinking well ahead as to where he wanted things to end up. Once the trajectory against the Germans shifted in his favor, up until then he's fighting defense and he's just trying to survive to next week. No. But once the things change, he now is putting in mind very clearly what his strategic objectives are. And what he realizes is he's going to take Poland eventually. That's going to come under Soviet domination, which means his domination. And that means he doesn't want opposition. Well, where is there opposition? There is a split in the political parties, the London Poles, as they are called, and the Lublin Poles, which is what this communist regime had supported. He doesn't want the London Poles to have any play in this at all, and he knows there's a large resistance group that's growing up in Warsaw itself. He wants them eliminated. So he gets close enough to make the resistance group in Warsaw, the capital, think liberation is at hand. So let's rise up and drive out the German garrisons. And when we drive them out, the Soviets will come in and we'll be free. Yes.
Was that the famous Jewish uprising? And
No, that was a different uprising. The ghetto uprising was earlier.
it was a similar strategy on Stalin's part, though, where he could have, but he didn't because.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, just, you know,
Well, you were a long way away from Warsaw at the Jewish
at
uprising.
the Jewish uprising. But the point is that he was never in a situation where he would expend energy if he thought it would help his opponents.
Well, I
And his
thought,
opponents were domestic as well as foreign.
I felt that he believed he might have missed a few in the Katyn forest, and he could take care of these oversights
Yeah.
in Warsaw.
The reference, if you're not familiar with the Katyn Forest, is that once the Soviets in 39 had taken over half of Poland, they gathered up, I think it was somewhere around 15,000 Polish officers and basically killed them and buried them in the forest. When the Germans found these bodies, and it was a propaganda thing, gee, look what the Soviets did. They killed all these people. The point was that brutality was the norm on this front. All right. As another part of this particular front, but the collapse of the German defenses in Poland, as you can see, has basically on the southern portion here allowed the Soviets to push all the way back to the Carpathian Mountains here, where you can finally, despite all your enormous losses, now try to hold the ground across the passes and try to stop the Soviets from entering Czechoslovakia directly. But Poland being open and without having the terrain features which are going to protect it, you're continually driven back. And this becomes a real problem. Now, as we see here, again, North Ukraine under Model, and he's been shifted around as a senior general to kind of shore up defenses in places that are collapsing. The first Ukrainian front, 1 million men, equal to Germany, but far outnumbering them in terms of combat capability. And this particular little site here, I'm just going to show you a blow-up map of the destruction of a German corps, the 12th Corps, near the town of Brody. And again, an example, just to show you what was happening on the front and how the 12th Corps is caught up here. And then as they try to break out and connect back up with German troops, they basically are destroyed. And so 30,000 German troops are lost there. This shows the enormous amount of territory that's been lost in just 2 months, coupled with enormous numbers of losses of men and materiel. And eventually, the Soviets are going to reach the borders of Prussia, which is right up in here, right? They're going to reach that. Romania is going to collapse entirely, and indeed, not just surrender, they're going to change sides. Again, a requirement by Stalin. It's not enough that you surrender. Now you have to turn on your former ally and fight them. Notice also the time frame. I said they launched their attack June 22nd. Normandy was June 6th. Part of the reason for the attack wasn't just the date of the anniversary. Part of the reason also was that the British and Americans were begging the Russians to do something aggressive on the Eastern Front to prevent Hitler from shifting resources from the Eastern Front to hold off the Americans and British in northern France. And part of the reason for that was northern France was closer to the borders of Germany initially than was the case with the Soviets. But now the Soviets have so crushed the German army that they're really coming very, very close to the German borders. Hitler had to try to weigh up how he was going to manage this situation because he feared that a strong foothold in northern France would eventually lead to the collapse of Germany itself. He could trade space in order to try to, remember that funnel, as the distance he has to protect gets shorter, he may be able to pull reserves out. But the collapse of Army Group Center basically just takes the heart out of the Eastern German army. And it's going to be a problem that can't be fixed in any particular way. This shows, again, different estimates of the numbers involved and things of this sort. But what I really want to emphasize here is that while there are great differences in the various estimates that we're seeing, the preponderance of the Soviets compared to the Germans is maintained throughout. And similarly, when we look at losses, again, huge losses for the Soviet side here compared to the German losses, but the Germans can't replace anything. As you lose ground, you lose population as well. And remember what I said earlier, Stalin is more than willing, once he has Ukraine, to take as many Ukrainians as he needs and incorporate them into the Soviet forces. He has changed, had the Romanians not surrender, but join the Soviet forces. So that automatically shifts up the numbers that he has available. Now he's got to supply them. Yeah, that's still a problem. But at the same time, they now are on his side. And that bolsters his numbers as well. So despite the losses that you see, it's an important element to keep that part in mind. And then I highlight this. What you see there is that this is a situation in which it's a reflection of what happened in 1941. I'm going to take just a minute to address this because we're just coming to a conclusion. In 1941, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they captured hundreds of thousands of Russian or Soviet prisoners. In one pocket alone, near Kiev, in Ukraine, the estimates were over 600,000. the Germans were completely unprepared to handle that number of prisoners of war. Just impossible. I mean, just think of what that number means. If you want to feed them even one meal a day, you know, within a week, you need almost 4.5 million rations, right? To say nothing of water. And that's just one meal a day. And then you've got to find a place to put them. And you have to guard them, and you have to do all the things that clean up all the sewage or whatever else that goes along with it. They're completely unprepared for that. As a result, the number of prisoners of war from the Eastern Front who survived was probably in the order of no more than 5 to 10% by the end of the war. Those that made it to concentration camps, and I don't use the word in the same terms as how these death camps were set up, but concentration camps of prisoners were used as labor as much as they could, but again, expendable labor, because from the German perspective, once these people no longer were useful to them, just let them die, get rid of them, okay? But they also didn't have the infrastructure to support. Well, the same was very much true for the Soviets in reverse. So when they captured prisoners of war from the German army, they were not looking on them very kindly, and they didn't have the resources to take care of them. Very different from the Western armies. When you read about how prisoners of war were managed by the Americans and the British, very, very different structure. Plus, the Soviets had a memory of the atrocities that had been committed by the German army. So there was another reason they weren't looking very kindly on them. And in the last series of lectures, I described a situation where the Soviets had overrun a town. They found a lot of German wounded there. It was wintertime. They dragged them out into the streets and sprayed them with water. So they froze. And when the Germans recaptured the village, they came in and found these bodies encased in ice. Well, water's cheaper than a bullet. Otherwise, they tended to kill the wounded because they weren't going to care for them. They didn't have the resources, and they didn't care. These were people who were beasts. They were monsters. And that was particularly true if you were part of the SS. If you were part of the SS, specialized German units, then you were going to be tortured, mutilated, brutally killed. There's no kindness involved there. So, just to conclude, Romania and Hungary are taken as the onslaught continues. Through this period of time, the enormous number of people involved is staggering for us to consider today. If you take all of the armed services of the United States together, and then you just compare it to this one front, today's, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, you throw them all in together, we have numbers that might reach what was going on the Eastern Front. And yet, there's more of this war going on elsewhere. Romania collapses, and Bulgaria does the same. Hungary is attacked, and the Soviets approach the capital, Budapest. And I will tell you just this personal story, having been in Budapest. There's an underground hospital under the Buda side. The Buda side is the mountain side. The Pest side is across the Danube, and it's flat going on. The Hungarians had built a hospital underneath the place where we stayed, and you could take a walk through the hospital, and they had a sound recording of the fighting going on overhead. And when you walked up on top and walked around, you could still find pockmarks from the fighting that occurred there. And it's an amazing experience because the hospital was built in anticipation, even before World War II broke out. It was built in anticipation of the coming conflict. As I walk through there, I recognize pieces of equipment that I've been trained on, which is a little embarrassing. But it just goes to show you. Okay. The drive here was that now with Romania gone, Ploiești's gone. So your fuel source is taken away from you. And the drive up towards Budapest was important for Hitler because at this time he wanted very much to keep the Hungarians in the fight. And the Hungarians were still interested in staying in the fight because they had no love at all for the Soviets. And as a result, there was very intense fighting that took place in 1945 around that city. I won't go into that at some here. Horthy had wanted to take Hungary out of the war, figuring, listen, the war is over. As far as we're concerned, we're done. But Hitler sent in people to capture him and replace him and keep him in the fight. And eventually this shows that as December 26th rolls around, Budapest is surrounded. There will be a relief effort. Now, I made this note at the bottom. Note the timing of the Battle of the Bulge. And there were a series of events that we'll cover if you guys want to come back for another series of lectures as to what's happening on the Western Front at this time. So the Americans and the British had driven to the frontiers of Germany, and Hitler takes an enormous number of precious resources in order to try to defeat the Western armies and launches a thing called the Battle of the Bulge, where it's an attempt to break through the Western lines and reach the city of Antwerp. And he was told, certainly by many of the senior generals, that was going to be impossible. As a result, resources were not available, and yet somehow, even after losing in the Battle of the Bulge, he's able to consolidate some armor and try to retake Budapest. So that'll conclude us for today. When I originally put these lectures together for this session, I'd hoped to cover Normandy, but I realized as we got into this that the better way to handle Normandy is to take from June 6, 44 into the end of the war. And I think it'll make more sense to everyone as we march through that particular time frame, because what's happening on the Eastern Front is, in a sense, a more compressed version from where we are now, even though it's still between January and May when the Germany formally surrenders. It's a little better construct, and that'll still give us time to finish off the Pacific theater. But it also means ignoring a lot of other theaters of war. But I hope this has been helpful in understanding particularly the enormous importance, at least I attribute, to the Eastern Front. The contest there, in my mind, bears a great deal of interest and importance as to how this war ended. Thank you. Yes.
One thing that I noted when we were in Budapest, that there is a unique monument to the destruction of the Jewish people on the shores of the Danube.
Yes.
That there are iron shoes that are going to rust away after 100 years.
Right.
As a monument to the Jews who were driven into the Danube and machine gunned right at the very end.
Yeah. There's no question about the enormous brutality. I haven't even touched on the death camps and the whole issue of the Holocaust, which in many people's minds, justifiably focuses on the Jewish populations, but involved a whole other category of people. Political opponents, religious opponents, vagabonds, the treatment of the disabled and things of this sort, all unbelievably brutal in its own nature. But I remember going there and seeing that. It's a very powerful.
It's moving.
Yeah, very powerful to see that. Yes.
I was aware of the Eastern Front, the importance of it in general, but I never heard it explained as well as you did, the details. It's incredibly, it was worth spending a little extra time on, I think, anyway.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes.
A strongly practical question. Here it has an enormous number of people, Soviets. And they've got the Urals, they've got people who are people who could fight, but who are there presumably building tanks. Where are the supplies for the tanks coming from? And what in behind the troops? Is the farmland? Are they still farming out there, bringing in food?
There was an element of that, but when they lost the Ukraine, which was characterized as the breadbasket of Europe, that was a real problem for the Soviets. And one of the major resources they wanted from the West, Span, became to what they needed to sustain themselves. Steel production had dropped off enormously as well, since that had been concentrated on the western part of the Soviet Union. The displacement of factories allowed the machinery to be brought.
Yeah.
You still had to have all of the other resources you need to make it. And we did send a fair amount there, but they were able to gear up production for themselves to a large degree. Other things that were deficient and remained deficient for them were communication things like radios, things of that sort, which made the complexity of operations very, very hard for the Soviets. And was probably part of the reason why some of the German resistance was stronger than it should have been, because they didn't have the communication to coordinate.
And I presume that those nice rebels who took the troops through the marshes were toast at the end because they were rebels.
Yes. In fact, that was also another part that doesn't get covered much in history, or you find a paragraph alluding to it. Once the Soviets took control of Ukraine, there had been independent groups trying to resist, not just join that was a different thing. When you join the German army, that was different. But these were just resistance groups. And Stalin felt that anyone who had been under German occupation was affected by German propaganda and was now an anti-communist. So it was very easy for him to go through and get rid of as many people as he could who might have any influence on the post-war situation. Solzhenitsyn's a good example of that, actually. He served in the Red Army, and then when he got yanked and sent to prison during the war. Yes.
I'm trying to imagine the situation of these ethnic enclaves. So in Romania, there were a lot of ethnic Germans. They would have been in the Romanian army fighting with the Nazis. Then the switch occurs, and there are now Germans fighting with the Soviets against Germany. How could they survive? Or probably many of them didn't survive because they were liquidated at one point, or they became deserters and got the hell out.
I think the best answer to that, and again, I'm not trying to project something here, is your life is on the line. What choice do you make? Not only your life, but maybe your family's, what's left of it, if it exists at all. And you know how harsh these regimes can be. So you don't count for very much. And your best idea is to go with the flow. You know, if it means shooting at a Russian soldier Monday and tomorrow you're shooting at a German soldier, so be it. You know, they don't care about you anyway. Yes.
So for those of you who are interested, there's a series that came out in Russia about 10 years ago called Soviet Storm. And it's about a 20-episode series, and it discusses every campaign that Mike discussed in infinite detail. And it's on YouTube, and I should get a job for YouTube. Right? It's on YouTube, but all those battles that he talked about, Ukraine, Leningrad, you know, Army Group North, everything is all on the Soviet Storm series in detail. And they got some other ones too, like Partisans, the Soviet Air Force, et cetera, too. So it really good, we'll do a good job of supplementing what he said.
Oh.
And that's made by that's the Russian perspective, by the way. That's made by the Russian government and
Right.
their assistants. And so it's the Russian perspective on World War II, not the Western perspective.
Right. One of the things that is very interesting to me is to look at Russian movies that deal with World War II. And they're very interesting in terms of their approach. In some ways, their humanity, which is something that we don't tend to see because we don't share the same culture and language and history. You know, we're not as closely tied to that as we are to Western Europe, not just in terms of immigration into the United States and background, but it's very interesting. At the same time, the early publications from the Soviet Union, which they call the Great Patriotic War, by the way, they don't call it World War II. Stalin was in very tight control over what was allowed to be said to the public. And if you didn't behave, you were imprisoned or sent to the gulags or whatever. It wasn't until well after Khrushchev that there was even a hint of the destructiveness that took place in the Soviet Union in World War II. That was buried big time. And then obviously under Gorbachev with Perestroika and opening up the archives, you now have people like David Glantz who have gone in and spent a great deal of time on the archives, producing a lot of data, but it still doesn't give you the story. It's hard to find that, especially from a Russian perspective. Whereas a lot of the information that you can get from people is from the German side, diaries and things of this sort. As an example, again, you can translate this the way you like in terms of reading it as a German history, but translating it into a Soviet history is easy to do. It's an author, now deceased, named Theodore Plivier, who wrote 3 books. One was Moscow, Stalingrad, Berlin. They're very intense, very intense. They're written from the German side, but you are in the trenches with these people, dealing with what they had to deal with. Unlike some of the other novels that just, you know, Nazis evil, you know, and so on, because those atrocities are all there. Plivier's books are hard to find. You might be able to find them. They're fairly expensive because they're old and out of date, but they're so good. I don't think the libraries have them. And there are just hundreds of other excellent histories. Just enormous amount of information. Yes.
As members of Lyceum, we are entitled to the resources of the Binghamton University Library, which has a connection with libraries across the entire Northeast So if you want a book, you can ask them to get it for you and they will.
That's good to
You
know.
don't have to
and I-
buy it.
No, I understand, but when I tried to get in touch with them about that on something on the Eastern Front and Army Group Center, they kind of said, we don't have anything. So I was thinking, I could donate my library to them, but I doubt they really are interested. It's a little too militaristic.
Mhm.
All right, Robert. Yes,
Mike, this has just been wonderful, and unfortunately, there will be a certain period of time before we come into the next series, but I wonder if you could just tell us what you think, what's going to happen to Ukraine.
now?
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna put a plug in for myself as well. I have a writing I do on a site called Substack. And I've been writing about Ukraine now for about 2 years, with the conflict going on. Ultimately, the solution, as with any military conflict, is political. And what will happen, in my view, is Ukraine is going to have to give up the territory that's been occupied by this Russian Federation. And it will not disarm. It will not immediately join NATO, but what remains of Ukraine will be rebuilt by the West. And you'll have this sort of line that exists the way it did across East and West Germany, where the Western Ukraine will be built up, become more Westernized, and eventually become more closely incorporated into the West. Whereas the part under the Russian Federation will struggle for decades. They don't have the economy. One of the things that I just am baffled by, and this goes right back to the beginning, absolutely baffled by it, is this fear on the part of NATO and expressed by our own administration that somehow the Russians were going to invade the Baltic states and, march into Poland. They don't have any capability of doing that. I just can't understand how anyone could possibly believe that'll happen when you have the example of Russian incompetence in the first months of the war, where they tried to take Kiev and Kharkiv, and they just stalled on a road. There's a description of a 40-mile long train of vehicles hanging out for 2 weeks. Now, if you can't organize, your units better than that, don't worry about Estonia and Latvia and the rest. The Russians have no capability of taking it, nor do they really have any interest. The reason they fought in Ukraine at all, again, my own interpretation, and I realize there's a lot of disagreement, was it was a festering sore ever since the Crimea was taken in 2014. If you go to that date up until 2022, for 8 years, there have been separatist fighting in Lugansk and Donetsk. And it just was sucking up resources, and there was no end to it, no end at all. And I think Putin finally said, screw this, Ukraine belongs to us anyway. When you listen to the long interview he gave and his description of Russian history, it's fascinating how, in a sense, delusional it is, but how heartfelt it is. They had to stop the fighting in Donetsk and Lugansk. It's just miserable for them, like the Spanish ulcer in the Napoleonic era.
To get in a little more detail, how do you accept the casualty figures that I find it hard to believe that the Russians have lost that many, and I suspect Ukraine might be a little more accurate. Some of it, I think, is wishful thinking on our part, but I don't know that.
Yeah, I don't think we'll know actual casualty figures. The way I look at it is, again, like many of the ones I present, they may look like accurate numbers. But if they're not from the British or American resources, they're partly delusional. Importantly, though, and exemplified in part, is the depth of resources which modern states can reach. So even if it's true that the Russian Federation has lost 300,000, and I take into that dead and wounded, and even if we say of the wounded, none returned back to the front line, which also is a whole proportion, the manpower is 3 times what Ukraine has. You can send all the weapons you want to Ukraine, but you run out of people. And remember that Ukraine has lost millions of refugees. Now, those weren't just women and children and old men, right? They were young men going with their families, and do they want to go back in Ukraine, which as a country prior to the war was noted as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So you look at that and ask yourself, am I going to go back home to that? Now, a lot of Russians left as well, but Russia was much quicker to close the borders to people leaving. And they're much more used to using central power to enforce what they want done. That's been their history from the get-go, I mean, going back hundreds of years. So the Russian people are much more inclined to go with the strong man than say we are in this country. You know, we're used to kicking people in the shins if they're bigger than we are just to get back at them. They have less of that. Maybe it'll change, but I don't think so.
Michael, reinforce your point about Russia not being interested in expanding into Europe. You've emphasized through all of these lectures that this is an ideological war, especially in the context of the Eastern Front. And both Nazism and communism were globalizing ideologies. What was Hitler's motto today? Germany, tomorrow, the whole world. And of course, Stalin, the international movement. And that's what he was, his after war plan was to expand the international communism. You know, McCarthy and Karen and all those guys weren't entirely mistaken. But the ideology of Putin and his coterie is that Eurasianism and Central and Western Europe is not part of their sphere of interest.
And the other reason I think Russia wouldn't try to push further is that they still fear China. Despite the connection between the two, and our press highlights how closely Xi and Putin are supposed to be working together, there's a wariness there because the Chinese, particularly historically, have never liked the idea that Siberia was taken over by the Russian Tsar. They are expanding their field of vision, not just as I've shown in other slides, to what's called the first and second island chain in the South China Sea and South Pacific region. But they're beginning to look north, beginning to think maybe up towards the Arctic is another place we want to be putting our footprint. So again, these are tensions which are going to exist throughout history. And I think what it takes, at least from my personal viewpoint, but thrusting that forward onto the responsibilities of governments, is to be aware of these particular issues and adjust to them to reality. One of the things we see happening, and the historians talk about this repeatedly, is how Hitler seemed more and more disengaged from reality in terms of what he was hoping to achieve with his armies as the world is collapsing in on him. But at the same time, I try, again, this isn't to commend him in any particular way, but Think of what you would be deciding if you're that guy and you're in charge. How do you figure out what's important and what isn't? And he's demonstrated time and time and time again that his generals gave him bad advice. But when they start really giving him good advice, he's no longer able to hear it. Whereas for Stalin, it was just the reverse. Early on, Stalin ignored, in fact, he decimated his military. Remember, 1937, I think it was 37, 38, he killed over 37,000 officers, including most of his most senior officers. Those most capable and talented and creative and in charge of how armies were to operate. 37,000. So he learned as the war went on, he had to listen to people like Zhukov and Timoshenko and others who were close to him. He had to learn to listen. So again, complex psychological, economic, social, political affairs are all wrapped up in this. And I think the lessons are still very powerful for us to consider. Not that we as individuals are going to determine the outcomes, but at the very least, how we judge the capability of the decisions that are being made by our own governments.
So is the $1 million question, is World War III on the horizon?
My view is no. Not in the terms of the way most people project it as a nuclear exchange. I think what we will see is the escalation of conflicts, particularly as certain demographics become increasingly important. This is a complex answer, but it's a very complex question. So I'm going to try to distill it down to this. The demographics in China right now are very unfavorable to sustaining their economy. They have a dearth of younger people.
The one-child policy.
Yeah, and they're going to pay for that for a long time. And even though they've lifted the one-child policy, the economy is such that most families can't afford to have 2 or 3. So replacement is not on the horizon for them at all. And that means they're going to suffer greatly economically unless other things happen. And that lies outside of the current political borders. That's why there's such an encroachment in the South China Sea and why they had this Belt and Road initiative that they've talked about. And things of this nature, which are all designed to try to strengthen the economy. Similarly, that's true in the Russian Federation. Their demographics are terrible. And another reason why they won't go further in terms of where they're expanding. The demographics are still having an impact even in Western Europe, and they have an impact in the United States. But what saves us, and I use the word in quotation marks, has been the immigration. In other words, and I'll use this word to refer back to, say, 1950, okay? I use the indigenous population in 1950 isn't reproducing in the way in which it was prior to that time. So immigration is what has sustained us in terms of growing our population with youth and things of this sort. None of the other countries involved either accept immigrants, even legal. I'm not talking about it, just put that aside. This isn't a political discourse, okay? But if you look at the number of people who want to move to China, the answer is very few. From anywhere in the world, very few want to go to China. And if you go to China, to become a citizen there is very difficult. Same is true with Japan. Same is true with Russian Federation. So in terms of just even getting people, they're on a downslide, and that has serious repercussions for them. It also means that when push comes to shove in terms of a conflict, the last thing you want to do is use nuclear weapons. So I think that in spite of one caveat to that, and that is that if for some reason the Russian Federation saw itself under a direct military threat by NATO, where it actually said we're going to invade the Russian Federation, that's when they would use them. Because they'd say at that point, if we're going to go down, you're going down. And I don't think NATO in the West has any interest in that whatsoever. For China, the issue is similar. Nobody's going to invade China. Nobody's that dumb, I hope. So there isn't any particular reason for them to use it. And I don't think that what's happening with Iran and their development of nuclear power and their proximity to having nuclear weapons, even if they use them against Israel, would trigger a massive conflict. I think everybody would just say, let them kill each other and be done with it. You know, we're tired of that 4,000-year history. Get over
There are
yourself.
so many moving parts. You have North Korea, you've got Iran,
Yeah,
you've got China,
nobody wants to invade North Korea.
Russia.
Like, why would you
No,
do that?
but they do have nuclear weapons.
They do, and if they try to use them, they're gonna be eliminated. South Korea will never go down without our helping them take care of that, and China's not gonna let them do it. The last thing they wanna do is have nuclear weapons blowing up along the Yellow River.
You've got tensions over Taiwan.
Yeah,
You
but
in the
again,
Philippine Sea.
would that require a nuclear conflict? I'm not saying it won't be an armed conflict at some point. I think that's very possible. And then the question is, are we preparing ourselves for that?
So a non-nuclear World War III could be a possibility.
Again,
Until the end.
the term world war, unlike the global war that World War II represented, will be more confined to surrogates. So that when you look at the Cold War and you look at the fighting in Africa and you look at the other places where there was fighting around the periphery, I think that's more likely to happen. And again, if push comes to shove for China, then they'll say, you know, what do we got to lose by trying to take Taiwan and control the South China Sea and make it ours?
Hey, we're gonna have to wrap this up. We're gonna have another group coming.
Yeah.
Oh,
What's the next class? You said there's the next.
Yeah,
class.
when's the next,
I have a,
when do we invade?
I'll have to get back to you on that.
Winter or spring?
I think it's gonna be spring. I have to look at the calendar. I got a note from them that
Okay.
asked me if I was gonna do it, and I said, it depends on the feedback.
Wonderful job.
Well, that's it.
Yeah. Oh.